Have you ever thought that you were 100% right, but you were 100% wrong? There was a guy by the name of Jimmy Ferris, and he was from Texas, rural Texas, and he tells one of the greatest stories I've ever heard in my life. He had a friend of a friend that had a bit of a problem. He had all of his plumbing was plumbed into an old cistern at his house, and so all of his sinks and toilets and bathtubs and kitchen sink, everything was plumbed straight into there. But because the cistern was lined with concrete, it sealed it up, and it didn't allow for any of the liquids to leach out into the ground, so it filled up. And about once a year, it'd fill up, and he had to pay good money to get it pumped out. And he was tired of it. So he decided that he was going to come up with a plan. Now, he knew that this friend of a friend, Jimmy, had some dynamite. And his idea was to have a controlled demolition down there in the bottom of that cistern to break up some of the concrete and then allow those liquids to leach down into the ground. So he told Jimmy, and Jimmy said, well, I think that's a plan that might actually work. And so Jimmy drove over there to his house, and he got there, and he showed him what was going on. And then the cistern, on the very top of the cistern was a hole. It was about this big, and he had that open, and he had about a 20-foot pole. And he was going to wire the dynamite to the end of that pole and run the fuse all the way up that pole and then set it off. And so Jimmy looked at it, and he said, well, I think... he knew a little bit about dynamite, and he said, I think all you need is about a quarter stick of dynamite. And this guy said, no way. I know what I'm doing. I need more. A lot more. And so he said he took 6 full sticks of dynamite, and he used baling wire, and he wired that to the end of that pole and ran the fuse up there. And when he got all ready, he shoved that down in that mess. The whole cistern was full. And he shoved it down in there, and he got that fuse, and he had driven his car over there, and he popped the hood, and he was going to ignite it by touching that fuse on both sides of the car battery. And right as he was about to do that, Jimmy, he said, hold up. He said, you do what you want to do, but I'm out of here. You wait until I back up. And so he got in his car, and he drove it in reverse for about 2 full blocks. And he just waited. And that old boy, he lit that fuse. The explosion that followed was something from the likes of Los Alamos nuclear testing facility. There was a column of black sewage that went straight up into the air, hundreds of feet, 300, even 400 feet up into the air. And the poop cloud mushroomed out, and then came the rain. What goes up must come down. Cars, lawns, trees, every roof in that whole area, nothing was escaped the judgment that had occurred in that neighborhood. Of course, our guy was still standing there at the epicenter of the blast, but he was unable to move, unable to talk. He was just standing there like this, still holding it to the car battery. And Jimmy said when he saw him next, he said any Army veteran would recognize that 1,000-yard stare from the shell shock that he had just went through. Well, just about that time, his wife came out of the house. She had been standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes. And it turns out that plumbing goes both ways. The kitchen sink, every drain in that house, the toilets were gone. They were blew up. Every inch of that house had been blown to smithereens and had poop all in that house, and she come out fire mad that day. She was racing out to see what in the world happened, and she was covered in it. Of course, there was our old boy just standing there. And Jimmy drove back up. He had his windshield wipers going, and he drove back up, and the old boy just pointed at Jimmy, and as if it was his fault. Well, Jimmy, he cracked down his window because he couldn't get out because of all the mess out there, and he said, I told you a quarter stick would do it. Isn't that how it goes, though, sometimes? We think we understand what we're doing. We think we see things clearly. We think we're 100% right about something. But in reality, we don't. We don't see it right. We don't see it clearly. And sometimes it takes a mess for us to realize just how blind we are to certain situations. It's true in life, and it's true also in our faith. We think we know Jesus. We think we understand who He is and what He's about. But then something shakes us. Something challenges our assumptions of who Jesus is and what He's supposed to do for us and what He is supposed to be all about. And that is exactly what's happening in Mark chapter 8. That's where we're going to be today. And you know that we've been in this series called Uncomfortably Close. And there are times when people get uncomfortably close to Jesus. And every single time that happens in the Scriptures, every single time something amazing happens. One of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible is Mark chapter 8 because of what's going on. Jesus is going to heal somebody of sight, but He does it in an unexpected way. I don't think there's any other miracle that happened quite like this. It is probably, in my opinion, my favorite healing of all the Scriptures because of the way that He did it. And in Mark, as he writes the book of Mark, Mark chapter 8 is a flag in the book. It's a high point in the book, Mark chapter 8, but the other one is Mark chapter 15. He's got two high points in the book, and they relate exactly to each other. So I want you to open up your Bibles to Mark chapter 8, and then go down to verse 22. Let me read this. He says, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand, and he led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes, okay, that's unexpected, right? We don't spit in each other's faces to help them, right? And Jesus does that, and there's some stuff to that, but he spits in his face. Okay, that's uncomfortably close right there. And so he spits in the man's eyes, and he put his hand on him, and Jesus asked, do you see anything? Did it work? Right? And look at his response. He looked up and he said, I see people. That's good. He has vision. But he said, they look like trees walking around. He said, I see, but I don't see well. It's fuzzy. Everything's real fuzzy. You know what I'm talking about. I see a bunch of us wearing glasses today, right? I see, but I don't see well. What in the world is that all about? You got to ask yourself, why? Did it not take? Did it not happen right? So he says, so it says this, once more Jesus put his hand on the man's eyes, then his eyes were opened, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And Jesus sent him home saying, don't even go into the village. This healing, you don't see another healing like this. And you got to ask the question, why? Did Jesus try, but it didn't go right the first time, and so he's like, oh, let me try again. And then on the second one, then it happened right. Or was the man's faith not good enough there? And so what's wrong here? There's something wrong, right? There's got to be something wrong here. That's what I think when I read this for the first time. What is happening here? But Jesus is doing it to tell a point, to make a very clear point here. And here's the point. This is it. If you like taking notes, this is it. Spiritual sight does not come all at once. That's the point that he's making. Spiritual sight doesn't come all at once. You grow in your understanding of who Jesus is. And this was playing out in real time in Mark. There's multiple levels of this happening. Not only is he literally healing a man in stages here, but spiritual sight is being unveiled as we speak here in Mark chapter 8. Watch this. Go back to Mark chapter 8, verse 1. And if you look at the heading in your Bible, what does it say? What is happening there in verse 1? Jesus feeds the 4,000, right? So he feeds the 4,000 with just 7 loaves given to him, so he does that. Well, then after that, the Pharisees, they track him down. And the Pharisees say, hey, we want to know, are you the guy? And we want to know if you can prove it. Do a miracle for us right here, right now, to prove it. Well, Jesus never loved people demanding things from him. I don't think he still does. And so he is upset with the Pharisees. Well, then right after that, he says something to his own disciples. He gets in a boat and he's crossing, and he says something cryptic to his disciples, and they don't understand what he's talking about. Look at what it says. In verse 15, he says to them, "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." Well, they discussed with one another and said, "It's because we don't have any bread." That's what he means. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about not having bread? Do you not see?" You guys see that? "Do you not see? Or do you not understand?" Okay? See, he's going to set something up here. Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes, but fail to see, and ears, but fail to hear? Obviously, Jesus wasn't talking about physical bread here. He wasn't saying you need to load up some bread for the trip. He was talking about the doubt and the unbelief of the Pharisees. Now, why does that matter? Why would that matter to the disciples? Well, see, here's the thing. For us, it's totally different than it was for the disciples. You got to remember that the Pharisees, for us, we look at the Pharisees and what do we think? We don't respect them because we know the full story, right? But that was not so with the disciples. The disciples grew up in a society where the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the Sadducees, they were respected, highly respected. The most respected people in their society was the Pharisees. And so they had influence in their lives. What they thought carried weight. And Jesus was saying it is highly critical that you don't allow those influences to creep into your own heart. He said, guard your heart against that, right? And so right off the bat, you have spiritual blindness. He talks about the Pharisees and Herod. They are spiritually blind. So that's how Mark chapter 8 starts. But then it goes on. And jump to Mark chapter 8, verse 27, right? After the healing. Then he goes on and he says, Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." Now that question right there, the first question that Jesus asked, is a safe question. It's got some distance to it, right? Who do other people say that I am, right? That's easy for us to even answer even today. Nobody has a problem answering that question. But the second question is the question that he really wants to know. He doesn't care about the first one. He cares about the second question. And it's a question that aims right to the heart. And every single one of us must answer the second question. And it was this: but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. You know, there are only a few options as an answer to this question. Who is Jesus? There's only a few options. Either you believe that he was totally insane, that he believed that he was God when he was not God. He actually believed that. That would make you insane. Or you believe that he is a total liar, that he told people that he was God, but he knew that he wasn't. He just wanted to be worshiped, admired. Or you believe that he's the Lord, right? Those are really the only options. You believe that he was God and that he was telling the truth. And Peter answers brilliantly, you are the Messiah. And this right here is one of the two flags in Mark. Mark chapter 8, you are the Messiah. Boom. That's a high point in Mark. That's a point of significance in the book of Mark. Now, we might think that Peter has full spiritual sight at this moment. It seems apparent. And Jesus would tell Peter, man, that's a great answer. I mean, you look at it in some of the other Gospels, some of the other guys tell more fully. He says, Peter, man, you didn't even come up with that on your own. God gave that to you. You know, Peter's like, well, I thought I was great, but maybe I'm not. And Peter says this answer, and Jesus said, that's awesome. And we might think that Peter sees Jesus fully, but he doesn't. He doesn't see him clearly. Look in Mark 8:31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must what? What's the word? Suffer. Isn't that interesting that right after he says, after Peter says, you are the Messiah, what does he tell them that the Messiah, what's the number one thing that he starts teaching about the Messiah? Suffering. Isn't that interesting? I wonder if it has correlation with those who follow the Messiah. And he says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, he wouldn't even look at Peter. He rebuked Peter and he said, get behind me, Satan. He said, for you don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. That is uncomfortable right there. That's uncomfortably close. And we see that while Peter confesses Jesus as the Messiah, he doesn't understand the mission of the Messiah. He knows that Jesus is the Messiah, but he doesn't know what the reason for the Messiah is. It's like suffering doesn't even compute with what he thought that the Messiah was supposed to be. I can't blame him. I don't think we would have either. We have the benefit of knowing the rest of the story. But if God comes to earth, we're not probably thinking that he's coming to earth to suffer. And Peter is just trying to protect Jesus. He's not being evil at this moment. So why is Jesus reacting so harshly? It's because Jesus wanted to make it clear that there is no way to the Father without suffering. Man, that is a tough thing for them, and I think it's a tough thing for us too. That there is no way to the Father except through suffering. Immediately, our minds start thinking, well, is that really true? We start to think, like, I don't know. We want to analyze that because that's not a comfortable thing to think about. There are no shortcuts, and suffering is fundamental to Jesus' mission and his followers. So now we have spiritual blindness by the Pharisees, and now in Mark chapter 8 at the end of it, we have partial sight. He understands that he's the Messiah, but he doesn't see it clearly. He sees people, but they look like trees walking around. Now, if we fast forward, flip over to Mark chapter 15, then you're going to have full, clear sight. Mark chapter 15, verse 37. In Mark chapter 15, verse 37, it says this. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, what? Surely this man was the Son of God. That right there, if you have a pen, circle that verse. If you have a highlighter, highlight that one, because that is the climax in the whole book of Mark right there. You have full spiritual sight in that moment. That is the second flag. That surely this man was the Son of God. The story in Mark 8 of Jesus healing the blind man in stages was meant to teach us that spiritual sight comes gradually. We do not give our lives to Jesus and then on day one, boom, see clearly. It is a process that the Holy Spirit does in us over time. We see here that both Peter and the centurion both confess Christ. They both confess Christ. And both confessions are connected with Jesus' what? His suffering. Isn't that interesting? Peter rejected suffering in Mark chapter 8, but how did the centurion recognize Jesus in Mark chapter 15? Through his suffering. When Jesus asked, "Who do you think that I am?" Peter was right when he said that he was the Messiah, but he failed to understand what the whole point of the Messiah was. And listen, if you don't understand who Jesus is, then you can't understand how to follow him. And Peter thought he knew Jesus. But Paul would later write that the only way to know Jesus is through suffering. I had some friends in Indiana, and they were going to a baseball game, and they had their keys. And some of you guys have those cars where you don't have to put the key in the ignition anymore. You just got to have it in your pocket. And they did that. It was in their coat pocket, and they got in the car ready to go, and then they realized, I don't need the coat, and so they took the coat, which had the key back in it, back inside. The car was already running, and they took it back inside and left it in there. They got in the car, and they drove all the way to the next town over, and realized on the way over there, we left the key at the house. We cannot turn off the car. And so they left the car running during the whole baseball game, and so they got back in there, and they went to go get ice cream. And they forgot, and they turned the car off. In that moment, now they're stranded. How in the world does that happen? Technology these days, it's great until it's not. Am I right? They needed the key. Well, listen to me. To know who Jesus is, do you want to know Jesus? I believe you do. There is a key. And Paul tells us that key in Philippians chapter 3. Turn there with me. It's one of these passages that you probably got highlighted in your Bible. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 10 and 11, it says this, I want to know Christ. Don't you want to know Christ? I mean, at the end of the day, I think you're probably like me, and yes, we want to know Christ. We want to know Jesus. I doubt that there's probably anybody in here that wouldn't say that. We want to know Christ, and so how do we know Christ? Look what he says. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection. Yes, who doesn't want that? The power of God in your life. I want to know Christ, and I want to have that power. That same power of his resurrection can live in us. So how do we get it? And then Paul says, let me show you the key. Let me give you the key. And look what he says. And participation in his what? Sufferings. Becoming like him in his death. And so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. There cannot be power of resurrection without a death. There cannot be glory without suffering. And Jesus would finish out, go back to Mark chapter 8. He would finish out by saying this in verse 34. Then he called the crowd, not just his disciples, he said he called out the crowd to him along with his disciples. He wanted everybody to know this. He wanted to be super clear. This was not just for his 12 disciples. This was for everybody. This is for you and me. He said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. but whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. Jesus wanted everybody to see clearly. And to follow Jesus meant to suffer. And Jesus made it clear from the very beginning that he was not calling them to personal glory or opulence or even comfort. He wasn't calling them to climb a ladder of success. He was calling them to put those things secondary to following Jesus. Suffering would be the keyhole through which we would see Jesus clearly. So for us, how do we go from spiritual blindness to clear sight? That's what we all want to know. How do we see Jesus clearly? And so for us, number one, we have to recognize where we are. We have to be honest with ourselves. Back in the year, I think it was around the year 2000, I got LASIK surgery done on my eyes. And they told me that it would last for about 20 years, and they were exactly right. A handful of years ago, I never wore glasses anymore, but I was getting my CDL license to drive a church bus. Please don't tell anybody that I have my CDL license, because I don't want to be the guy asked to drive the bus, okay? So keep that between you and me. But I got my CDL, and I took the test, and I failed the test the first time, and then I took it again, and I passed the second time. So I'm a safe driver now, but I passed the test. Well, then they make you take an eye exam. And so I covered up my left eye, and I read the bottom line clearly. And then I covered up my right eye. It was fuzzy. I couldn't read it. I had to split my fingers open to read the thing. And then that told me, what does that tell you? You need to go to the eye doctor. I don't see clearly. My right eye is fine. My left eye is bad. I thought I was seeing clearly until I covered it up. Some people are spiritually blind, and they don't know it. Like the Pharisees. They think they see fine, but they're missing the truth about Jesus. Some people are spiritually blind. Some people are like the disciples. They see Jesus partially, but they still need clarity. We need to recognize where we are spiritually and let Jesus bring us to full clarity. Ask God to help you where your vision is blurry. One of my favorite Psalms is also probably one of the scariest prayers that you could ever pray. And this is my encouragement for you this week. Pray this prayer. In Psalm chapter 139, verse 24, you know it. Search me, O God. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. And then it says this, see if there is any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. Guys, pray that prayer this week. Search me, O God, and show me where there is anything that I don't see clearly. Help me to see you clearly. But number two is this, be willing to be uncomfortable. Are you willing to be uncomfortable? I mean, maybe I shouldn't even just say it like that. Maybe I just say it just like Jesus. Are you willing to suffer? Are you willing to suffer for Jesus' name? Sometimes we avoid suffering by numbing ourselves with distractions or seeking an easy faith. But what does that do for us? I had a friend in high school named Ace Berry. Ace Berry was a tough guy. His dad was one of them old mean old farmers that you know about. You probably know one of them, right? Some would say my dad. I would say my dad was that way. But Ace Berry, he was an animal on the football field. He was an absolute beast. He was coachable, but whenever it came time, football is a violent sport played by violent men. I love it. And Ace Berry was a violent man. And whenever he would get on that field and he would strap it up, I mean, his eyes would just light up. You did not want to meet him in the A-gap, okay? And so Ace Berry, he would hit you as hard as he could. Well, he hit somebody so hard one time that whenever he went to wrap up, their helmet hit his bicep and it totally exploded his bicep and it crushed it. He said that was obviously amazingly painful. But he said it was nothing compared to the recovery. He said as long as he held his arm like this, it didn't hurt. But he said the doctor came in and he said, listen, you're going to be fine if you stretch your arm. He said if you keep it like this, it won't heal. It'll heal wrong, and then it'll lock up, and you'll not be able to use your arm for the rest of your life. And so his dad, being the nice, gentle man that he was, every 30 minutes and every hour he would come and he would take Ace's fist and he would just pull it open like that, and Ace would just scream in horrible pain. But see, healing wouldn't come without the pain. Ace had to embrace the pain to be healed. Jesus says the same thing about following him. It's going to be uncomfortable. If you're really going to follow him, it's going to be uncomfortable at times. But it's the only way to truly live. Taking our next step in our faith is not always easy. I mean, there's our steps of faith. Believing. I mean, that's not easy. If you come to believe in Christ, you have to admit that how you've been living your whole life, for your entire life, is wrong. You have to admit that you are a sinner, that you need saved. You have to admit that. That's not easy. Then belonging. If you're going to take the next step in your faith by belonging, that means being with us and doing ministry with us. That's a hard step that not every disciple makes because it's too hard for them. They are not willing to be here consistently. They're not here to get to small groups, or they're not willing to serve in ministry teams, or they're not willing to serve in the community. Why? Because it's hard. It requires effort. It requires consistency. It's not always easy. But Christ never said, hey, man, if you feel like it and if the weather's good enough and if you're, it just kind of falls into your schedule. I know you're busy, then, yeah, I've got this cross over here. Then pick. No, man. If you want to follow Jesus, it's going to cost you. And then the last step, becoming like Jesus. I promise you, it is not easy to become like Jesus. Because at the very core, becoming like Jesus means putting other people in front of you. That does not come naturally to any soul that was ever created. We all put ourselves first. That's what Jesus has called us to. He has called us to suffer. Different people suffer in different ways. But Christ is calling you to follow him. And he never called you to do anything that he wasn't willing to do. He didn't call you to do anything that he hasn't already done. At the end of the day, that's picking up your cross. The last thing is this: trust the process. It doesn't happen overnight. Peter didn't confess Jesus as the Messiah and then come to spiritual sight overnight. You've probably heard this story. In 1985, Joe Simpson and his climbing partner, Simon Yates, they were climbing in the Peruvian Andes. Giant mountain. But during the descent, Joe fell into a deep crevasse. And Simon couldn't see him anymore. And he obviously assumed that he had died. And so, heartbroken, Simon went back to the base camp after losing one of his best friends. Problem was, he didn't die. He survived, but he couldn't walk, and he had no gear. And he was up on the top of this mountain. So how does he get down a mountain? Well, and the reason that he survived the ordeal was not because of anything else other than his mindset. He said, the thought of getting down the mountain unable to walk was overwhelming to me. So he said, I just had to focus on small goals. And he said, I would look over and I'd say, I'd try to crawl my way over to this crevasse in the next 20 minutes. And then he would get there. And then he would see, I want to crawl over to this red rock in the next 20 minutes. And he would do that. And he just, over and over, he just took the next step. And he said he did that for 4 days. At the very end of it, he said he was totally out of strength. He was dying. And he said the last little bit of it, it was probably just a 10-minute walk. but it took him 9 hours. But he got there and he survived. How? By taking the next step. It takes time. But man, Jesus has called you to something great, but sometimes he doesn't show you the whole journey. Jesus never shows us the whole journey, does he? He only wants you to look at what's in front of you and take the next step. He is calling you to more. There's not anyone in here that he has not called us to more. Each step of spiritual obedience will lead us to spiritual clarity. And Peter, I love this. Peter, at the end of his life, he shows that he did see clearly. In 1 Peter 4:12, he says, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." Peter got it. He saw clearly. The good news is that Jesus does not leave us in our blindness. He calls you to see. And when you see clearly, it changes your life in ways that you never thought possible. Have you seen that video from several years ago when the colorblind guy gets his glasses to see color for the very first time? Check this out.
Happy birthday, dear Daddy.
Yeah, okay.
Happy birthday to you. How does it look?
Oh, that's weird.
Look at the balloons.
Oh, the trees are neat.
Now you have rose-colored glasses,
Saw it
baby.
before.
I know. Now you see with our eyes.
Doesn't look like mud.
It looks like brighter mud.
That's it. Jesus opens our eyes to see color where we had only seen shades of gray. Can you trust him to show you what you've been missing? Will you take the next step, even if you don't see everything just yet? Because when you do, one day you'll look back and see that he was leading you to clarity all along. Let me pray.